Tuesday, April 14th. This is House Education. We have a small window of time that we're going to take advantage of with some time with Legislative Council. John's going to start with us, and then Beth will be here this afternoon. She needs to work on an amendment, but is here just in case there's a question. John, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about the areas that you feel comfortable talking about. I will say, in just sort of doing a quick scan, pages 1 to 29 sort of fall within the interest area of us. And then it seems to be there's a lot of regional assessment district stuff, and then school construction picks up on page 74. So wherever you feel.
I'm going to jump to the school construction sections if that's
okay. Page 74.
That's okay. So joining the Zoom now, and I hear a nice staticky sound that sounds like the ocean, which is very pleasant. Okay. John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. I will screen share, trying to go quick here. So I'm starting with section 65, and this is on page 74. And this is the start of the sections that address state aid for school construction. There's a number of updates here, just high level before jumping into the sections. I think the sort of easiest orientation to offer is that what's proposed here is, you may recall from last year, what passed in Act 73 was a debt service subsidy model, similar to what Rhode Island does for providing state aid for school construction. That contemplated aid in the range of 20 to 40% under the program for eligible costs. Those would cover your ongoing debt service costs, and you would get up to that 40 based on bonus incentive. The base amount would be your 20%. What you're seeing here is a proposal to supplement. It's sort of part of an ongoing effort to seek revenue sources for the state aid program, and it's proposing to leverage additional state bonding capacity. That's the orientation I think you can see for these sections. So section 65 is a set of findings and intent. Do you want me to read these or just, okay. I'm going to hop to the important, what stand out to me then. The findings are pretty intuitive themselves, but if you jump on page 75 to the, actually 76 to the intent, I think you can see kind of the timeline of thinking beginning on line 8, and these I will read. So in the short term, catalyze the state aid for school construction program by providing state aid in the form of up to an additional $50 million annually in state bonding capacity to support the construction or renovation of school facilities that support the consolidation of school governance structures and improve access to educational opportunities for public school students. So this is saying the intent is in the short term, take additional $50 million annually, and there's later language to address this alignment with CDAC. You're going to want to make sure that you're in alignment with CDAC, and there's a recommendation from the Treasurer's Office, but catalyze the program with this additional bonding capacity, and it's intended to support the construction of school facilities that kind of align with the broader goals of the Act. That's the thinking. In the long term, this is on line 14, provide state aid in the form of a debt service subsidy to school districts pursuing school construction projects that align with the program. And then throughout the kind of transitional phase, so throughout the education transformation, provide state aid through multiple funding streams. So not just bonding, not just debt service subsidy, you could have both until the burden on property taxpayers imposed by school construction expenditures can be reduced. And then on 77, this was implicit in the Act 73 draft, but leveraging the capacities of the Vermont Bond Bank for purposes of state intercept, protecting the state's credit rating, all the reasons that came up in the task force and working group on school construction. So those are your intent sections, kind of framing this set of sections that I'm going to walk through. Section 66 is trying to staff the school construction division of AOE. So it establishes 4 positions: 1 school construction program director, 1 financial manager, 1 school construction coordinator, and 1 architectural design reviewer or educational facility planner. These are drawn from the AOE recommendations in one of the many reports they provided in Act 73 that address the kind of staffing levels that they would need for the school construction division, which is something that needs to be stood up to really make the program operational right. I will note that the last of these, the 1 architectural design reviewer or educational facility planner, it was unclear from the recommendation whether multiple would be needed. This provides kind of the minimal set of positions that were requested there. It could be that additional reviewers or planners are required. And subsection B is addressing the budgetary piece of this. It does not set out an appropriation for these positions, but it says that the Secretary of Education shall include as part of their budget request for FY28 a request to appropriately fund those positions. Section 67 is on page 78. This is setting a deadline for the adoption of rules for school construction by AOE. You'll recall from Act 73 that the rulemaking authority for the school construction program is transferred from the State Board of Education to AOE. And so there's going to be an existing set of rules that the AOE already has. But this is setting out that other continue to build out the program and then specifying some particular rules that need to be included. Some of this was already to an extent addressed in Act 73, but there's greater specificity provided here and a deadline set, March 31st, 2027. The specific rules that are called out here, and of course, this is just within the scope, right? And we can do more than this. These are just ones that need to be addressed. Prioritization and bonus incentives that support the construction or renovation of school facilities, support the consolidation of school governance structures, and improve access to educational opportunities for public school students. You're going to see that call out several times. I think at least one more. We went through it once in the intent section. This is the tie to the sort of observed goals of the Act. It's like a generic call out as to what the Act is trying to achieve. So it's tasking AOE with developing those prioritization and bonus incentives with effectively the goals of this Act in mind. Bill currently. The other piece that AOE needs to specifically address is the treatment of school districts' outstanding capital indebtedness as of December 31st, 2025. And we will come to a legacy debt aid provision later in the bill as well. But this is rulemaking from AOE on the treatment of outstanding indebtedness. Section 68 is a task for the State Aid for School Construction Advisory Board. This was stood up in Act 73 as part of the new state aid program. And unlike the other provisions, which do not go effective until this summer's July 1, this advisory board currently exists, and you've likely already seen about a 15-page report from folks on that committee with some recommendations. So this is tasking that advisory board with on or before December 1st of this year, providing a written report to the legislature that identifies opportunities for the construction or renovation of school facilities. Same call out I've read a bunch of times, support the consolidation of school governance structures, improve access to ed opportunities. So the report is supposed to identify places, sites for construction or renovation of new school construction facilities. On page 79, line 1, subdivision 2, provide a full siting study for each identified school construction. That would include your cost, location, and any other relevant factors. And then in subdivision 3, analyze the compatibility of those different opportunities. As you can imagine, if the advisory board is identifying all opportunities for this kind of construction, it might be the case that only some are compatible with others based on geography, right? So the last subdivision 3 is saying, consider the set of opportunities you identify in conjunction with each other and kind of assess statewide the different scenarios for this kind of construction. And then in sub B, you see that in developing that report, the board shall specifically consider how to achieve appropriate scale and research on school size and travel times and how to achieve regional comprehensive high schools. I think this is the language that Rep. Olson was noting just now during the caucus of the whole. Section 69, we are now getting to amendments to the State Aid for School Construction Program chapter of Title 16. Act 73 set out this statement of policy, which evidences some intent that the legislature has. And what you see added to the statement of policy in subsection B, which is on page 80, is what you might expect based on, I hope, the orientation I gave, which is trying to align this with this leveraging bonding capacity for certain kinds of school governance structures. So it is further the intent of this chapter to prioritize school construction projects that align with the creation of new school governance structures under, and we have this language here that's complicated. This is language that's just the stand-in for calling out H 955 because you're amending the Green Books. We can't say this act, right? You're amending statute. And so the call out you have is legislation enacted in 2026 that requires each school board to participate in study committee. So intent of this chapter to prioritize school construction projects that align with the creation of new school governance structures under H 955. And it is the intent on line 7 of this chapter to leverage additional state bonding capacity to support the construction of these projects while the state identifies the total school construction need to be supported by state aid offered under this chapter. So that's one of the issues that Ways and Means was grappling with, is where do you start? Do you start with total financing available, revenue sources? Do you start with the total need? And what you see expressed here in this intent is leverage additional state bonding capacity while continued identification of the total school construction need. I will also call out that, lest you think intent language has not much effect, it is worth calling out that the rulemaking pieces and some other elements of this chapter do pull in the statement of policy. So they do have more of a substantive effect than many standalone intent sections. Section 70 is a simple amendment to the responsibilities for the Agency of Education under the program, and it is implicit in other changes that we will see in greater detail in just a second. So on page 81, it is already required under the program for AOE to include as part of its budget request an annual school construction funding request, again, coming effective this summer. And what's called out here is in alignment with that effort to leverage state bonding capacity. They need to include as part of that annual school construction funding request any projects contemplated for funding through state bonding. And this will be even clearer once we get to the application and approval section of the program. Section 71 is kind of some cleanup, clarifying changes to the State Aid for School Construction Advisory Board. Again, unlike the other sections of the program in Act 73, this is already effective. And what this does is, under existing law, the board has the administrative, technical, and legal assistance of the AOE. And this is clarifying that the school construction division specifically and the school construction program director are explicitly available to the board for purposes of assistance. Hopefully that would already happen, but this is clarifying. And then the repeal of subsection G is truly cleanup. Last year, we set in statute a time-limited provision that has now passed. That report has been provided. You don't need to keep that in law, so it's struck. On page 82, this is an amendment to 16 VSA 3445. Whenever I talk about this section in any committee, and I'm sure here I've said it, I call this kind of the core state aid section. This is what sets out the application process, the award of construction aid. This is the piece people are typically touching when they're trying to most dramatically affect the approval, affect the program itself. I've included here is a lot of ununderlined text for context. So you're going to see some of the preliminary approval and eligibility conditions that's just for context. I will talk about the changes on page 84. And they really begin at the bottom of page 83. They will make more sense when I talk about some of the sequencing issues that become more apparent later on. So maybe it's helpful just to frame that. We talked about in the intent section that I started with, that there's this short-term vision, leverage additional state bonding capacity, long-term vision, debt service subsidies, and then during the transitional phase, you could receive both. Of course, what this means is that if you're receiving state bonding, your school district doesn't need to bond as much as they would, right? They're not receiving necessarily the full amount of debt service subsidy on the full approved cost of the project. They're actually going to reduce the local bonding to reflect the fact that the state itself is bonding as well. So this disrupts the sequencing of the program that has existed for some time. It's always been the case that preliminary approval, prioritization, and final approval require the district to have already voted the bond. Of course, they now can't do that because they need to know what the state aid is before they can set the size of the bond. So it introduces this sequencing problem. And so the tweak you see on the bottom of page 83 and 84 is not to really change anything about one of the eligibility conditions, which is that the applicant, the school district, would achieve the level of proficiency in the school district quality standards regarding facilities management adopted by a rule of the AOE. This is not meant to be a substantive change to that requirement. It's meant to make clear that you wouldn't be excluded if you are a newly merging district and you haven't yet been deemed proficient, right? Which, as I understand it, is a self-assessment. So I don't know how much of a practical problem this is. But the language that you see at the top of page 84 is trying to address the fact that you might have a newly merged district that you don't want to exclude from the state aid program and might accidentally be excluded by this condition. So the new language says, or if the applicant is a newly formed school district, the applicant will achieve the level of proficiency in the school district quality standards regarding facilities management at its initial performance evaluation under the district quality standards. So not intended to be a substantive change. That is one of the eligibility conditions, but trying to ensure that you don't preclude those folks from access to the program. And if the idea is to tie school construction aid to attempts to incentivize merger, of course, be quite unintuitive to exclude newly merged districts from the program. The piece that I talked about with sequencing of the bonding is what you see here in subdivision 3 on page 84, line 13. In existing program, following approval of a preliminary application and provided that they have voted funds or authorized a bond, the agency can assign priority points. That has been struck for exactly the sequencing reason that I talked about. And I'll talk about where that is added, because obviously at some point you do need to know what the actual district authorization is. So that is the release of funds under the program would be contingent on that approval. Okay, subdivision 4. Request for legislative appropriation. This has been implicit in the amendments to the agency's responsibility under the program and kind of implicit in a lot of the other pieces we've talked about. But the agency shall submit its annual school construction funding request to the governor and shall clearly identify, and I'm on the page, top of page 85 now, those projects contemplated under subsection 3440B, that is the statement of policy section that we walked through, that express that intent to leverage additional state bonding capacity for acceleration projects that align with the creation of new school governance structures under H 955. So include in your budget request those projects that are meeting that for funding through state bonding. Following submission of that recommended budget and submission of the capital budget, because under law, any state bonding requests would be required to be included in a capital budget request. So following submission of both the budget and the capital budget, the House Committees on Education and on Ways and Means and the Senate Committees on Education and on Finance shall recommend a total school construction appropriation for the next fiscal year. And there's a call out, it will make more sense later on. This doesn't really have a substantive effect for inclusion in the education payment, but later on there's a broader section that speaks to the payments that go out to school districts. All kind of education payments are grouped under this large piece. It shouldn't affect that the payments do go to the districts. It kind of affects the form in which they go to the districts. Very bottom of that page, same struck language related to voted funds or authorized bond for the sequencing reasons we talked about. This is for final approval, but again, note that release of funds would be contingent on that approval. I should note that you could imagine this introducing some practical problems, right? There are going to be some difficulties in determining, for instance, at the top of page 86, making arrangements for project construction supervision or providing for construction financing of the project if you haven't voted the fund, right? Like the old sequencing allows for a lot of final checks to happen before you are approved, but because you now can't vote the bond until after approval of state aid, you're just going to have less information available at the final application approval. So I just want to note that that is a kind of a practical problem to be dealt with. And there's a question to me whether you can even make arrangements for project construction supervision if you haven't. Like I just don't know how feasible that is. But at the very least, the requirement for voting and authorizing the bond prior to final approval has been struck at the bottom of page 85. We can go to page 87. So we've jumped out of the application process, that preliminary application followed by final application, which can be sequenced quite quickly. You can do preliminary and immediately followed by final. You now have the award of construction aid. So what you see if you ignore the updated text, what was said on Act 73 is that the base amount of award shall be 20% of eligible debt service costs. Projects eligible to receive an additional 20% of eligible debt service costs. And the updates here are that the base amount shall fund. This is a technical change that had to occur because you couldn't calculate the eligible debt service costs based on the same percentages if you're now supplementing with state bonding. It would effectively reduce the local bonding that has to occur, and you might throw off the calculation of aid. So the base amount award shall fund 50% of the total approved cost of a project, and projects are eligible for funding of up to an additional 45% total approved cost. I will call out, because this question came up in Ways and Means, the use of the phrase total approved cost. This is not defined, but it is something that has been used throughout the program and is contained in the handbook, for instance, that accompanies this. The idea is that you submit an application right with the project, and then only a certain amount of costs are approved. So you aren't getting full coverage of aid on the full project, only those approved costs.
Which the AOE has in their capital outlay formula. Is that where that?
I think, yeah, this would be covered in rulemaking.
Really, yeah. Idea being they're going to cover a building, but not a AstroTurf football.
It provides ways to, if you didn't have a provision like this, you could imagine projects being dinged because they happened to have sort of superfluous or non-necessary, right? You'd have to make a call on the package as a whole, rather than just being able to evaluate those assets that fit under the program. Subsection B is the piece that we talked about a number of times at this point. It's setting up the framing or the form for the kinds of aid. Construction aid shall be awarded as a debt service subsidy. That's what was contained in Act 73. As support through state bonding. That's what's set out here, or as a combination of both. Amounts shall be awarded annually or subject to an annual appropriation for the purposes of the program. And this is the sequencing piece, and shall be released only once the applicant has voted funds or authorized a bond for the total estimated cost of the project to be covered by the applicant. We no longer need this subdivision B.
I want to be considerate of your time. You're due in appropriations at 1. We're happy to keep you here until 1, but I also want to make sure that you have a chance to grab something food.
I don't mind keeping it going.
Thank you.
We no longer need to call out to eligible debt service costs because, as we discussed in subdivision A, that's been replaced with total approved costs with the change to contemplate both debt service subsidy and state bonding. So just removing a now superfluous provision. And at the bottom, page 87, subdivision C, just to explain the path that got to this, Ways and Means, much like the intent language that you heard earlier about leveraging $50 million additionally in annual state bonding capacity, had initially included a provision here that set that out. It said debt service subsidies up to an annual cap and state bonding support available up to an annual cap of 50 million to ensure that the bill didn't misalign or contradict in any way CDAC's recommendations. This was updated to be a recommendation measure. And my understanding is that folks would go talk to CDAC to see what that additional bonding capacity is. So here, what you see in subdivision C is that the treasurer, in consultation with the Capital Debt Affordability Advisory Committee, CDAC, who recommends those annual biennial total state bonding amounts, shall recommend to the House Committees on Education and Ways and Means and their Senate counterparts the annual total state bonding support available and the annual debt service subsidies to be awarded in this chapter. So this is kind of a call out to fiscal prudent science to ensure that there's not a divergence. You're receiving that recommendation. On page 88, this isn't something that was discussed in a lot of detail, but starting on line 5 is the addition of wage requirement provisions to the state aid program. My limited perspective on this is that I don't think this changes anything. I think it basically just clarifies that these existing laws are already out there. And so it says that any contract awarded for school construction that is paid for with state aid shall adhere to the higher of 1, the prevailing wage requirements established for state construction projects, or 2, the prevailing local wage requirements as determined by the U.S. Department of Labor under federal law. So this is saying there are independent prevailing wage requirements in both state and federal law. You need to adhere to the higher of these if it's a contract for school construction that is paid in state aid. Section 73, this is something we talked about a bunch last year, but never happened in the bill. Existing law has a prohibition on state aid for any projects that was the need for which results from significant deferred maintenance. As you can imagine, this might be a large portion of Vermont's school portfolio. school facilities portfolio. So this is repealing that prohibition on state aid for projects where the need results from significant deferred maintenance. Of course, in the big difference that occurs from this is you dramatically expand the pool. But the other way to think about it is I think it was probably implicit in folks' understanding that the pool was already that broad, if you weren't thinking about the prohibition on aid for those resulting from significant deferred maintenance. Okay, section 74, I'm guessing this is one that's particularly interesting to folks. This is a new section of Title 16. This is actually in your state funding of public education section. Legacy debt aid. So starting on line 16, a school district shall be eligible to receive aid equal to 100% of the debt service cost of any debt incurred by the district for costs related to facility construction and renovation as of December 31st, 2025. I'm going to pause and just walk through the separate factors kind of there. So one is 100% aid for debt service costs. Second, this is for debt that is incurred by districts for costs that are related to facility construction and renovation. This is intended to be a broad call out, essentially capital indebtedness. There was some concern that capital indebtedness might not be treated to include things like planning or sort of things that necessarily accompany capital projects. And so the call out is the costs that count are those related to facility construction and renovation. And then there's a temporal limitation, right? It's those as of December 31st, 2025. So legacy aid, 100% of debt service costs on essentially school construction debt that existed as of the end of last year. So that's the eligibility for that aid. And then the second piece is that aid shall be awarded annually for those debt service costs up to a maximum total annual amount of $61 million, subject to an annual appropriation for purposes of legacy debt aid. As I imagine folks know, don't know a revenue source. So this is establishing eligibility for this 100% aid, but it would be subject to annual appropriation and subject to an annual cap. To call out where that cap comes from, that's on the basis of looking at, might have been the advisory board's report, it might have been one of the task force reports, but it was one of the estimates of facilities needs and kind of what the maximum annual existing debt was. So that's where that $61 million figure comes from. But outstanding question where the funding for this aid would come from. Page 89, sections 75 and 76 are the same thing, but done twice to capture amendment to current law and to future law, because the current law will be amended by the provisions of Act 73. So we have to hit it twice. This is the piece that I called out earlier that I said was not intended to have a substantive effect, but said that the committees of jurisdiction would recommend a total school construction appropriation that would then be included in the education payment. That's what you see here is amending the existing section of state funding of public education called the education payment section to say that annually the General Assembly shall appropriate funds for an education payment to pay for the whole bucket of things that go out to school districts. And it would include, this is kind of the big piece that was added on lines 5 and 6, any other amounts the state is obligated to provide under this chapter or chapter 123 of this title. So this is grouping the school construction payment with the other education payments. That's what this section is trying to do. It's not meant to change the amounts paid. It's just grouping them together. Section 77 is all the pieces I've talked about up to this point are July 1, 2026 pieces, other than those effective on passage for like reports and the like. We are now jumping to supplemental district spending, which does not exist until the rollout of the foundation formula. You'll recall that there are contingencies associated with that you guys worked on. And I think the date is July 1, 2030. So this wouldn't be effective until July 1, 2030. This is an amendment to the definition of supplemental district spending. You'll recall that supplemental district spending has a cap of 5%, right? And what you see at the top of page 90 is excluding from the cap school construction expenditures. So the worry was that in the future, folks wouldn't be able to pursue school construction projects. So those expenses would be excluded from the supplemental district spending cap. One thing I flagged in Ways and Means and would like to flag here is that it was never resolved where school construction would fit in the funding structures, whether it would even, the first instance, be subject to supplemental district spending, whether it's raised in that way. And I just want to call out that when you include this, you kind of implicitly resolve the question of where it comes from. It is now coming from supplemental district spending. That was not resolved last year. So I just want people to not accidentally make this decision. It may be a good decision, but I would hope folks don't accidentally look into it. Of course, you have lots of time before this happens, but that's what's included.
Can you say that again?
Yes. So last year, it was not resolved where school construction would fit in
Right.
with the foundation formula. One of the many outstanding details to be resolved this session, subsequent sessions. And so this year, people have raised the issue, well, isn't the supplemental district spending cap going to prevent school districts from pursuing school construction projects? Implicitly accepting the position that school construction would be funded through supplemental district spending, but that just never was resolved last year. It's sort of a natural place to think that it might fit. I don't mean to say that it's a bad idea. It literally was never resolved. So in including this provision to say that the cap on supplemental district spending doesn't apply to school construction expenditures, you are implicitly accepting that supplemental district spending is where school construction is raised in the future. You have plenty of time, but this is just it feels like it could be the resolution. It just feels like a lighthearted way of walking into the resolution of that question, if that makes sense.
It's basically saying a district votes on.
Exactly. On page 90, section 78 is the ballot language for the supplemental district spending. Again, future effect of the foundation formula. You'll recall this ballot language from last year in Act 73. The problem that this new language is trying to resolve is, and this is something that exists in the current system, so it's not necessarily something that you have to do, but it is intuitive to do this. What if a school board authorizes school construction 1 year and then doesn't subsequently want to approve supplemental district spending to support the bond payments? This is language that makes it such that you only approve supplemental district spending for ongoing debt service costs, capital indebtedness at the initial authorization of the bond. So you do it once for those pieces. Any other supplemental district spending you do on a regular yearly basis, but this is just ensuring that you don't unhook the bond vote from the supplemental district spending and get into a strange situation where folks are voting down obligations that they have. And to provide clarity, it sets out 2 ballots, one that would be included for any sort of ongoing regular supplemental district spending, and then one that would be included at the bottom of page 92 for that initial authorization to the school budget vote. I'll try to go quickly through the remainders. Section 79 is repealing some transitionary measures in Act 73 that need to be updated for the new timeline. So it's not substantively changing them, it's just pushing out the timeline. That's what you see in sections 80, 81, and 82. Those are your EOP, supplemental district spending cap, homestead property tax rate transitions. No substantive changes, just moving the timeline to align with the new foundation formula rollout. Section 83 similarly is an existing provision of Act 73, but this is delaying the Department of Tax's report on the homestead property tax rate transition. Nothing new here other than a delay in correcting an issue with the effective date in Act 73. Section 84, very similarly, is pushing back the tax report on the homestead exemption structure from this December to December 15th of 2028.
John, I'll hold you right there. I think we can probably read through all of that. I don't want to take up any more of your time since you have to be down there.
Great.
Thanks very much for
Thank
running
you.
through that very quickly for us. That's really helpful. All right, committee, we are officially taking a lunch break.